Okay, I think we have about 2 minutes to kick off. And we have all our presenters here ready to go. And we have a good number who are watching the session as well. So it might be good to just explain how this is going to work. As you all know, that all the presentations are recorded. So it will not be presented live. We just play the recordings for each speaker. And whilst the recordings play, if you have any question or any thoughts, please feel free to be using the chat box and put your questions and ideas or comments in the chat box. And then we can pick that up during a discussion session. So I think what we'll do is that once we start the session, I would introduce each speaker, and then the presentation will be played, another speaker introduction, and then the presentation will be played as well. Once we get to the end, then we will have the discussion on all the papers, and I would make sure that every presenter has opportunity to contribute to the discussion session. Now I have the very important task and a real privilege to also introduce and congratulate a paper in our session that has been given an award, the Reviewers Award, and that is paper number 3 on designing human digital twins for behavior-changing therapy and rehabilitation, a systematic review. And that is by that's Martin Wolfgang, Lauer-Schmaltz, and Philip Cash, John Paulin Hansen, and Anja Maier. So congratulations, Martin et al., on the award. That is a great achievement. Very well done.
Thank you very much.
Well done. So having done that important job, I think we are now set to go. So our first presentation, as I said, we have Fanika who will be helping us to be playing the recordings. So the first is Rajvi talking on service design approach to elevate the patient experience during home x-rays. And Rajvi is studied BA in product design at the India School of Design Innovation in Mumbai, and is currently working as a user experience designer at InnoMinds. So I think if we're ready, Fanika, let's play the first recording from Rajvi.
Good afternoon. I'm Rajvi Parikh, a UX designer at InnoMinds India. During my final semester in my product design course at the Indian School of Design Innovation, my professor and co-author, Mr. Shrivastav, and I discovered a possibility in applying service design to healthcare in India to overcome problems related to accessibility and unorganized service setups. This potential area turned into a thesis project, which evolved into this paper, Service Design Approach to Elevate the Patient Experience During Home X-rays. The flow of the presentation starts with the current service context and progresses to literature highlights and case studies, which help establish the objective of the study, followed by the methodology, research outcomes, and current gaps, conclusion, and discussion. Home X-rays have been around for over a decade, and yet most people don't know about its existence. The patients availing this service are generally elderly, immobile, disabled, or those suffering from chronic diseases. There are 3 types of home X-ray service providers: hospitals and clinics, diagnostic centers, and third-party organizations. Hospital, clinics, and diagnostic centers mainly provide the service on a need basis and sometimes actively promote it. However, third-party organizations actively advertise this service. They gain greater patient footfall as they undertake the requests on behalf of the organizations like hospital, clinics, and diagnostic centers. While there are extensive rules and guidelines for clinic and hospital x-rays, the rules for home x-rays are negligible, allowing organizations to set their own standards, resulting in a rudimentary service requiring better user experience. Literature highlights. The modern way of life, combined with an aging population, has increased the prevalence of chronic diseases. Patients with chronic diseases require greater care and attention at each step. The present state of healthcare organizations, wherein it follows a silo structure, that divides the problems into manageable pieces is built for a complicated world and not a complex one. The healthcare system needs to reevaluate its silo structure and consider better communication and collaboration between departments to tackle the complexity brought about by the chronic diseases. Healthcare organizations are often reluctant to invest in process revamps, which lack a tangible outcome due to high running costs. Technology and equipment are given priority, undermining the non diagnostic components of the service processes and thus the patient experience. A service process revamp is often driven by commercial and political imperatives rather than the patient experience, leading to the need for continual innovation and underutilized solutions. By following an incremental innovation approach, strategies can be built upon and change can be timed, managing the costs. Patient satisfaction is key to trust, treatment, and acceptance, and availing the service again. By providing an unsatisfactory experience, the organization may risk instilling a sense of mistrust. Satisfaction can be integrated by designing the end to end service process as seen in the following case studies. The example of General Electric's MRI machine displays the power of process innovation. While Doug Dyer's designed an award winning MRI machine, he was shocked to see the real world scenario wherein the children were traumatized by it. He went on to create the adventure series by following the design principles. Dietz was able to provide patient satisfaction and delight to the pediatric patients by solely focusing on the service process without looking into new technology, treatment, or equipment. The second case study, the breast cancer examination in a hospital in Oslo, underlined the value of patient needs and innovation efforts. It analyzed the entire service process and reduced the waiting time by 90%. They could reduce it further, but they found that the patients were not mentally prepared to get diagnosed sooner. Most people would assume that lesser waiting would result in a better experience, but by actually empathizing with the user, the need was found to be completely different. The waiting time actually helped them. Leading us to the objective. Using an example of service design in healthcare, this study aims to uncover the potential of service design methodology to solve complex primary healthcare issues and create patient centric solutions. The study describes the application of service design approach in diagnostic services by emphasizing on home X ray services. Qualitative methods were undertaken to collect data and analyze it. These images are from the body storming session. The main observations in the picture indicate that the roads are narrow and crowded. The radiographer is bearing the equipment load of over 50 kgs, and to top it off, he is dressed casually, not wearing his radiation safety gear, while holding the machine in his hand to take the images. These are all detrimental to his safety in the long run. Research outcomes and current gaps. Branding. Home X-rays are an unpopular service as seen with the prevalence of unawareness between the survey respondents and medical professionals. A good awareness strategy and timely delivery of relevant information can mitigate this problem and reduce stress and anxiety. However, service promotion needs to be conducted in a trustworthy manner to be most effective. The different types of services lead to a lack of standardization, resulting in poor practices such as casual or semi formal attire rather than a medical uniform. Smart communication. Technology can aid service processes to overcome barriers related to communication and comfort. By allowing different methods of booking, the people are made autonomous. For example, a large population of elderly people in India are dependent upon their family members if they're required to undertake online bookings. So, a calling option can give them the independence they require. The younger generation often prefers online bookings over call, and thus different methods can help different stakeholders. Efficient internal communication channels can help overcome the silo structure and improve user experience. Safety. There are three main components to safety: equipment, occupational, and people safety. It is necessary to adhere to all in order to mitigate the risks involved. As seen previously, lack of official guidelines result in the ignorance of precautions for the usage of the radiation safety vest. Organizations must establish their own safety guidelines and enforce them in order to provide a safe service experience to all stakeholders in the long run. Transportation. Topography is a key factor for home X-rays as the radiographer will spend more time on the road than he or she does during the examination. It is essential to make their journey safe and easy. Topography changes from city to city, area to area, country to country, and thus the service area's topography must be assessed while deciding upon the mode of transport and equipment packaging. Conclusion and discussion. Service design is able to provide hassle-free experiences as it considers all the stakeholders and their journeys in tandem. It understands the connections between the front end, back end, while also bringing attention to new or generally ignored touchpoints which can become essential in healthcare. Although higher adoption rates can be expected, the awareness levels are still low. Service design can help increase adoption as well as prepare the currently rudimentary service to improve in quality and provide patient satisfaction on a larger scale. These outcomes and research data have been presented to a company in India which is interested in launching a home access service in the near future. They've shown interest in these ideas and will hopefully develop them further to create a service with a truly wonderful user experience for all stakeholders. The following are the references.
Thank you very much, Rajvi. So our next presentation is on the MedTech Product Development Framework for Post-Pandemic Era, and that is by Natalia Glazkova. And Natalia is a PhD candidate in Engineering Systems program at Skoltech in Russia. So please, Vanika.
The research on MedTech product development framework for post-pandemic era is performed by the research team from Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology in collaboration with the Karfidov Lab Design Bureau. The goal of the paper are to define the MedTech development process for a case study, identify core areas for improvements, and to propose an improved framework for MedTech product development. The case study is based on an input from small enterprise engineering design company. The development product has hardware and software components, and the development process lasted through years 2020 and 2021 and was influenced by pandemic. In this research, we studied the conventional design process for MedTech and best practices of rapid manufacturing during crisis. We've proposed a case study, conducted design interviews of development team, and drew an idea of zero diagram. Based on the key findings from it, we've proposed an improved framework. What are the challenges of MedTech product development during pandemic? Well, first it is the disruption of conventional manufacturing. Secondly, it is an urgent need for accelerated design and production. And thirdly, it is faster regulatory approval. As a case study, we've investigated the development process of intramuscular injector. This is the hardware piece with the software component. Its purpose is to provide effortless automatic drug injection, enabling non-professionals to safely administer the drug without an involvement of third-party assistance. During our study, we conducted interviews with the development team. In all cases, the interviews were organized as face-to-face meetings and were conducted with each team member individually. The framework covers 28 questions across 5 domains. By asking those questions, we aimed at figuring out the level of consistency among the interviewees, whether they had the same understanding of stakeholders, product, and how it is intended to operate. As the next step, we developed IDEF zero diagram with the purpose of documenting the design process as it was organized during the case study. In the paper, we show the decomposition of IDEF zero diagram of as-is process down to level 1. The design process consists of 6 blocks representing the major activities performed by the development team. Each building block is a manufacturing function with input entering the left side, controls entering the top, mechanisms and resources entering the bottom, and outcome exiting the right side. Based on as-is IDEF zero diagram, we identified the drawbacks of design process, and I'll walk you through the scheme. So here are the same 6 blocks as in as-is diagram I showed previously. Again, they represent the major activities of the development team. These activities are aligned with the traditional phases of development process. The bottom scale shows the time, people, money, effort during each of the 6 activities in relative scale. According to the interviews, first 4 activities took 3 months of development, while the following 2 activities took 30 months to deliver and required the most of resources. Defining detailed design and manufacturing, which is block 5, appeared to be the limitation stage. From the case study interviews, we also found out that during first 4 activities, the team faced poor communication transparency, lack of common understanding of goals and stakeholders, and unclear understanding of roles and responsibilities within the team members. Regarding blocks 5 and 6, the team wanted to implement all features at once, and that led to the very time-consuming and complicated design process. Besides, there were no proper knowledge management and knowledge transfer, and the team faced lack of transparency and traceability. In the result of the design interviews and IDF0 diagram, the key findings were defined, which later formed the basis for the Agile Lean system thinking framework. I'll walk you through the framework. From the previous diagram, we kept the 5 traditional product development phases and the resources bar at the bottom. The proposed framework relies on building a concise quality management system with the reference to the medical device records. The green sector on the top of the diagram represents the QMS with the relevant medical device records. The agile cycles are evolving from planning to pre-production, meeting the need of each phase. During the planning phase, by acting agile, the team can formulate requirements with the stakeholders and end users and establish a common understanding of what product the user is expecting. To address the lack of process management during the concept and design and development phases, the framework proposes an agile approach with the short sprint cycles. By implementing highly iterative process with prompt feedback from end user, it becomes possible to reduce waste and provoke intense cooperation in the team. The new framework suggests avoiding over complexity of the new medical product by moving to the feature-based agile development. Prioritization of the functionality allows to deliver MVP as early as possible according to Agile Manifesto. Each cycle includes the review step to check an alignment with product strategy, requirements, and other artifacts. Production of medical product with the hardware and software components can hardly be delivered in the Agile sprint cycles. Therefore, the framework suggests adopting concurrent engineering principles to mitigate long lead items. The concurrency of the design process at the later stages is represented by the turquoise set of rectangles. The next sector with the purple rectangles represents the lean principles that are applied at the review stage of each agile loop to ensure knowledge gain, overall transparency, and traceability. Keeping medical design records as part of QMS eases the knowledge transfer across multidisciplinary teams, regulatory authorities, and manufacturers. The proposed Agile Lean System Thinking Framework improves transparency and traceability of the design process, forces communication across multidisciplinary team, and outlines regulatory compliance early in the development process. All this helps to deliver the product user really needs faster. Well, thank you, and I'm open for discussion. Please send me a note if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And please let me remind you that do put questions in the chat box if you have anything that comes to mind, please. So the next is the award-winning presentation on designing human digital twins for behavior-changing therapy and rehabilitation, a systematic review, and that will be presented by Martin Wolfgang. And Martin has a Master of Science degree in Mechatronics from the Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen-Nuremberg, and focusing on autonomous robotics and artificial intelligence since 2021. He is now pursuing a PhD studies as part of the European Union Horizon 2020 REHIBE project, where he is developing a human digital twin for rehabilitation with exoskeletons. So, Fanika, when you're ready, let's start this.
Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Lauer-Schmaltz, and I'm a PhD student within the Responsible Innovation and Design Group of DTU Management of the Technical University of Denmark. And welcome to my presentation about designing human digital twins for behavior-changing therapy and rehabilitation. First of all, I want to clarify the question of what a human digital twin actually is. And you might know the concept of digital twins from other big domains, like, for example, industry, where a digital twin can be described as a virtual representation of a physical entity that is connected to this physical entity with a bidirectional data stream for synchronization and for affecting the physical entity with feedback. A human digital twin extends this concept by observing the human as a physical entity. And as you might guess, this poses additional challenges. So for example, in the conventional digital twin, we usually observe physical attributes, while on the human digital twin, we can also observe, for example, cognitive attributes. In our paper, we aimed at answering the question on what are the main design considerations for designing a human digital twin specifically for behavior-changing therapy. And to do so, we conducted a systematic literature review based on the PRISMA scheme, where we identified 19 papers out of 695 papers found in 3 major databases. In the end, we came up with 8 main design considerations that can be assigned to 4 themes, which I want to present to you now. The first theme we identified concerns regulatory and ethical considerations, where especially identifiability and traceability, as well as security and privacy play a big role. As you can imagine, confusing the human digital twins with each other could cause severe health consequences to the patient due to wrong therapy decisions. Furthermore, new regulatory and safety aspects could always require a modification in the human digital twin as well as in the underlying system. In addition to that, security and privacy plays a big role. And of course, this also plays a big role in conventional digital twins. However, since we're now working with medical and personal data, a theft or abuse of such could have way more severe consequences. In addition to that, there's also an ongoing ethical discussion, especially about data ownership that you might know from other domains such as social media. So you can conclude that human digital twins should always include unique identifiers and version numbers, as well as that data protection ownership should have priority already during the design. The second theme concerns transparency and trust that can be affected within any of the 3 major layers of a digital twin that are the data collection layer, the data storage and processing layer, as well as the user interface. Within the data collection layer, the main threat to trust is posed by the quality and consistency of the perceived data, as in contrast to industrial applications, for example. The human body does not include any integrated sensors, so we have to rely on often noisy and non-continuous external sensors, or even on manually inserted data that can often be of low quality, biased, or corrupted. Within the data storage and processing layer, there is a high demand for explainability and understandability, as those decision support systems can, due to their high complexity, often referred to as black box systems, making them hard to understand, especially for non-expert users. And then finally, in the user interface, there is a high need for simplicity and intuition. And of course, this is also the case for most of the other applications. However, we have to remember that especially in therapy and rehabilitation, we often work with older or cognitively impaired people, and therefore simplicity and intuition plays an even bigger role. Therefore, there's a high need for human digital twins to be able to handle inconsistent and long quality data, as well as that decisions must be made in an explainable and understandable way, and the user interface needs to be designed in a simple and intuitive way. The third theme concerns dynamism and flexibility, where flexibility and adaptability play an important role, as humans, as well as their environment, can be seen as highly dynamic systems. For example, the patient's condition, as well as the involved stakeholders, like for example, therapists, can change frequently. Furthermore, there can always be new regulation that may require modifications within the human digital twin, as well as the underlying system. So there's a high demand for human digital twins to be adaptable in all life cycle phases. The fourth and final theme concerns behavior and cognitive mechanisms. And while, of course, there are various important cognitive mechanisms out there, the reviewed literature particularly highlights motivation, as it is a key aspect for the effectiveness of the therapy. In that context, human digital twins particularly could contribute to the principle of self-design. That means that you can actually observe the human digital twin and evolve yourself towards a specific goal, as well as to the principle of self-discipline. That means that the digital twin could give you reminders that it would, for example, be time for your next session. Furthermore, there is a very interesting concept of embodiment that unfortunately is only mentioned by few of the records. However, this means that the human digital twin could be connected to a virtual avatar, for example, to make the digital twin actually visible and therefore way more graspable and intuitive. That said, motivational feedback is a very important feature to increase the effectiveness of the therapy, as well as that embodiment is a very powerful way to actually contribute to that effectiveness and motivation by making the digital twin more graspable and therefore eventually even form a bond between the patient and the digital twin. And as a final step, we then elaborated a human digital twin framework for behavior-changing therapy, which is based on the conventional digital twin framework with its 3 layers, where we then just included the just mentioned considerations, such as the embodiment, for example, into the specific areas or components of this digital twin. This was it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I could give you some interesting insights into this topic. And I'm very looking forward for your questions and interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And our next presentation is on Lost in Transit, implications and insights for making medical task trainer prototypes with an open source hardware paradigm, and that is presented by Daniel Nygård Edge. So Daniel is part of the industrial, as a PhD candidate through the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. So he does research in early stage product development, focusing primarily on prototyping, the role of maker spaces, and open source hardware. His research is part of the TRO Labs, a prototyping and product development lab for community at NTNU in Trondheim in Norway. So Fanika, please, let's start.
Hello and welcome to this presentation on the paper Lost in Transit, Implications and Insights for Making Medical Task Trainer Prototypes with an Open Source Hardware Paradigm. The paper is written by me, Daniel Ege, together with Marius Auflem and Professor Martin Steinert. This paper presents an open source and novel intravenous cannulation task trainer that was developed during the COVID-19 pandemic for unsupervised clinical skill practice. The case presented in this paper showcased both the development journey of the task trainer, the deployment of the trainer in structured user testing, and obtained insights and implications for utilizing this device in unsupervised training scenarios as an open source hardware design. The case exemplifies and highlights the importance of structured user testing and user-centered design mindset when providing open source hardware healthcare training solutions. By showcasing the prototyping journey of the case project, we aim to exemplify user-centered and prototype-driven development of medical training equipment. More so, we show how to effectively deploy prototypes with users to gain valuable insights for further development and for sharing insights in the context of open source hardware solutions. When starting out this project, initial prototypes were made to elicit expert users' tacit knowledge quickly as a primary bounding object between designers and practitioner. We started with low-fidelity prototypes, and one made of latex gloves with thin-walled tubes glued to the inside was made to observe how practitioners would interact with the wearable task trainer. We further iterated with different materials and solutions to recreate the tactile and visual realism of an IV cannulation task. Between each iteration, expert users were consulted to guide further development. The final design consists of a 3D printed case with a high-density melamine foam inside, with the silicone tube and the silicone skin. The prototype also has a flexible strap that makes it possible to attach the prototype to a trainee. We wanted to observe how the task trainer prototype is used in a realistic scenario in which nurses practice IV cannulation skills in an unsupervised group setting. To capture realistic interactions and potential user errors, 13 nurses and 2 nursing students practiced in a session for IV cannulation training in their workplace. The 15 participants on average used 3.2 attempts to correctly insert the IV cannula in the task trainer's vein. However, as we can see in this histogram, half of the participants used 2 or fewer attempts. Maybe more interesting is the observed users' errors we found. Because after the training session, an experienced nurse assisted us in a video review to determine user errors and procedural mistakes when using the task trainer. Most of these procedural mistakes would cause excessive pain to a patient or increase the infection risk. However, the maybe most interesting observation is the one in picture labeled F. Because here we saw a participant that cheated the task trainer by using the casing of the prototype as a guide to insert the needle correctly. Because the vein lies perpendicular to the case, so this participant could perfectly insert the needle in the vein by using the case as a guide and sliding the catheter against it. This paper has briefly described how prototypes can be leveraged to uncover user errors through user interactions in realistic scenarios. In this case, we saw new needs and requirements that arose because of the observed user errors. We argue that emphasis should be put on mitigating such errors during the design process and as early as possible. When designing training equipment emulating the human body, we have an inherent trade-off that the designer needs to address, that is realism and foolproof designs. Because if the aim is to make a task trainer as realistic as possible, it needs to allow for the same mistakes that can be done on actual patients, such as the procedural errors we witnessed in this study, but can at the same time allow for learning errors. The solution might be to focus more on user feedback to reduce improper use. We argue that the development of open source hardware is more than just sharing technical blueprints. There is a need for detailed instructions and testing of designs in context to reveal sources of error extending beyond the technical capabilities of the hardware itself. We also need to consider the intended user and how we address the user when developing open source hardware solutions. Providing sufficient assembly instructions and making sure people can assemble and use the device is quite simple. Understanding how the product will be used, altered, and interacted with is, however, more ambiguous. Compared to traditional prototype testing and evaluation, designers lose control of the situation. So a solution then might be to observe how users interact with the device in an unsupervised setting. Then insights and observations can be used to address this uncertainty. While current open source hardware research is focused more on the availability of manufacturing tools, sharing practices, and licensing, there is a lack of research and best practices regarding the development process and sharing of knowledge generated throughout development. So to conclude this paper, we considered a case of a novel intravenous cannulation task trainer that was developed during the COVID-19 pandemic. The task trainer was designed as an open source device for unsupervised clinical skill practice. We saw multiple user errors when observing 13 registered nurses and 2 students using the task trainer during a 2-hour unsupervised skill training session. Without user testing, these insights and other interactions might not have been identified. These insights raise the question of how open source hardware needs to share more than just device descriptions and assembly instructions. As designs are being shared only in its current state of an ongoing project, sharing insights, user errors, and test results should be encouraged. Therefore, we argue that the insights and learnings from an iterative design process should be shared on the same basis as final hardware designs to take full advantage of open source hardware's potential. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Now our final presentation is on user-centric process of designing a molecular and cellular query interface for biomedical research, and that is by Tiffany San Liao. Tiffany is a user experienced developer in the Gellenberg lab at the Department of Biomedical Informatics at the Harvard Medical School. Leos is currently working on designing, developing, and enhancing the usability of the NIH Human Biomolecular Atlas Program's data portal. She received her BS in bioengineering from the University of California in Berkeley. So, Fanika, when you're ready, please.
My name is Tiffany Liao, and I'm part of the Gellenberg lab at Harvard Medical School. And today I'll be presenting on a user-centered process that we use to design a molecular and cellular query interface in the biocomputational informatics field. So in this field, there's typically issues revolving around usability. And this is because of the complex software development involving large amounts of data that does not traditionally involve users in the design and development process. This leads to issues such as confusing navigation and biological terminology that doesn't make sense to the users, and software issues. So therefore, user-centered design is a process that can highly benefit this community, since it involves users in all parts of the design and development process for a software product or tool. Here you can see the typical cycle of user-centered design, but as you see in our case, and in cases of complex software or product development, oftentimes there are aspects of the project that can lead to disruptions in the cycle. Our team is part of the Human Biomolecular Atlas program, also known as HubMap. This is a consortium funded by the NIH Common Fund as a central resource to map the human body at a cellular resolution. So our team specifically worked on designing and developing the user interface for users to access and explore the data generated by the consortium. You can see this here at the data portal linked here or at the QR code, and we do employ user-centered design philosophy for these interfaces. One of these features where we did this was how the user accesses the molecular and cellular information. To the right, you see a screenshot of how users can currently access the information in the database for donor samples and data sets, but there's no easy way to access the molecular and cellular information. And there are design guidelines for an advanced query interface in general, but not for a specifically biological informational query. Therefore, we want to do user research to show what type of features we need to develop to make sure this interface is user-friendly. So about our team organization for development, since this greatly impacted our design process, is we don't have a central coordination when it comes to development. Our team is responsible for user research and user interface development, as well as data visualizations, while other teams are responsible for the API and the backend infrastructure. So in the case of the molecular and cellular query, the API is developed by a separate development team. And what happened here is there was simultaneous implementation of the API during the user research phase. Therefore, we had to understand what the API will be able to support throughout all the phases before our development began. And we did this through remote communication, documentation, and a Python client that can access the API. The API team did tell us prior to user research that they'll be supporting these 6 queries, which we wanted to validate through user research. So the user research that we chose to do was semi-structured interviews with biological experts, which was a target user group that we identified in prior user research. And we did differentiate between the types of biologists, experimental, computational, and both. And the results of our interview was done through interview coding techniques and affinity mapping of those interview codes. And this is what we found. We did validate what the API development team was doing was going to be useful to the users. And in the case that users were not quite as sure, it is because of the confusing terminology. Therefore, when developing these interfaces that support these queries, we had to make sure that they were going to be in user-friendly terms. We also asked users what type of queries they would like to support for the molecular information. And then they were the cell types, spatial, biomolecules, and donor information. We also asked users how they would like to see the outputs, and this was going to be visualizations, contextual information, the ability to download raw data, and provenance information related to how the data is, where the data is coming from. So this led to us designing the interface based on our user research. So we communicated back with the API development team, and we found additional limitations. We found that not all the planned queries that they told us at the beginning of user research was going to be actually implemented. And for the ones that were going to be implemented, they were going to have very slow API response times. So we came up with these minimum user requirements for the API development team to reach in order for this to be a usable feature. And therefore, we came up with a high-level user flowchart that is typically used with advanced query interfaces. So our inputs in this case would be this list of data sets that is currently already supported in our search interface. They can pre-select whatever data set they want to do a query action on. The queries that we would be able to support are a gene or protein query, and they'll have to select the parameters that match that query. And they'll get a filtered list of outputs that matches the query that they chose to do. And this was supported through visualizations and metadata to give context. So these are the still frame mockups that we designed through Figma. It is an interactive prototype, but here you see the still frames. In the inputs, you see that list of data set that user can select, and they can perform what type of query they would like to select. Here is a gene or protein, and the parameters that matches that specific query. Here you see a gene query parameters. And they'll get a filtered list of data sets that match that query that comes along with visualizations and the metadata that supports the results. So during the implementation phase of the design process, we found several issues with the API again. And this is because the API development team was still developing the API when we were developing the user interface. So the API was constantly changing. This led to an instability of the API. So therefore, a single call to the API oftentimes will crash the API. And the API was essentially incomplete since we could not tell if we were doing a biologically incorrect query ask or if the API was just broken. So therefore, our currently implemented user interface does visually reflect the mockups, but there's no use for user interactions. And therefore, we can't do proper user testing until the API is fixed. So an evaluation of the design process in our case is we had quite a bit of issues because of our team organization that led to quite a bit of technical issues. And this is because we have no central coordination and because of the separation of development responsibilities. So our different teams do have different priorities and timelines for development, and this led to a somewhat concurrent development of the API during the user research and design phases. This led to, of course, a lot of technical issues. But of course, with user research, we were able to communicate better what the user needs and wants more clearly to the API team to make sure the API team understands what needs to be delivered. We were able to discover some usability issues prior to development, and it is guidance for future work. So talking about future work, we will be continuing development of the user interface once the API is fixed and doing user testing by the relevant experts. We will also be adding features requested by the participants, such as cell type queries and spatial queries in the future. I would like to acknowledge these people for this work, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. So that ends all our presentations. And as I said earlier on, please, if you have any questions, you can put that in the chat box, or you can just request to share your video and audio and then join us in the room. And then you can ask your question verbally. So either put it in the chat box or just join us, and then we can have the discussion. We've got plenty of time left for discussion. So there is a question in the chat box for Natalia, and it says, how would the framework handle requirement changes? Since I couldn't imagine that the development at some point could be stuck within one development phase. How could this be prevented? That's a question from Martin. Martin, do you want to clarify your question for Natalia to respond to, please?
Yes, sure. So basically, we saw this graph with all the iterative processes in each stage, right? And I was wondering, since I'm following the development from a computer game actually at the moment, and in that computer game, it was from Ubisoft, they were stuck in one development phase, because they had 3 new managers because the requirements changed all the time. And that made the whole development process now last for like 9 years or something. So I was wondering, I mean, those requirement changes can happen always. And I think such a agile development process, of course, has the benefit that it's like way more dynamic. But on the other hand, I could imagine that this is also very prone to like get stuck in one development phase, since you like just go over and over and over this development phase all over again. So
Natalia,
how would you
want to
prevent
respond to that? You're muted, Clement. Still on mute.
Maybe has the same problem that I had before.
Still muted. Do you want to refresh your browser and come back, please? Just try a refresh. Okay, so while we wait, I think I was going to ask a question, Tiffany. I guess talking about requirement changes, I was actually thinking about the user requirements that you gather for your work. I mean, have there been any conflicts in those requirements, and how do you manage conflicts in the requirements of users?
So that's a very good question, because, for example, the minimum user requirements that I said earlier in that presentation, that was basically the minimum the API could return at the time. We had better minimum user requirements based on user research. For example, users wanted to search on cell types, right? Which means searching on, for example, they want to see liver cells, right? But if the query can't support that, we had to find some sort of minimum user requirements. But when the API develops in time, then we need to add that user requirements in, right? So I think it's just having good communication with the development teams on when those user requirements do come in, making sure that gets into the development processes. I mean, of course, that's tough when your development teams not even having the same boss, if that makes sense. So like I said, there's no central coordination for us. So it's not like we can say, can you please focus on this? Because there's no one coordinating all of us together, right? So they have to be motivated to follow what we tell them, all the user requirements.
Okay, so that's a much bigger problem, isn't it? To deal with first, having your own structure in place.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's very tough. I'll say that.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back, Clement. Is Natalia there to respond to the question?
Yeah, well, Natalia just stepped out. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
She'll be back in a minute. Of course, to answer Martin there, you need to control the requirements at one point. You iterate, and that's why if you look at this figure, when we discussed it with Natalia and the co-authors, is that we still keep part of the stage gate where you stop and you make a decision to see, okay, to go to next step, okay, do we add or do we stop there? You know, you cannot iterate forever and add requirements forever. Otherwise, yeah, you're going for extremely high cost and loss of time and entry into the market, right? So you need at one point to make decisions. I think Agile lets you be flexible and listening to the customer, but at one point you have to make a critical decision to say, well, to go to next step, we need to stop there. I think that this is, or we can adapt slightly things, but we cannot continue to do this all the time.
Okay, thank you, Clement. If Natalia comes and wants to add something, just let us know, okay?
Yes.
There is another question for Rajvi. So there's a question about, does the perception on X-rays vary globally? And do you have insight on this? Or did you consider this in your work?
Yes, so there is a big difference also in terms of there are cultural differences, whether it's a developing or developed country, there are differences. Also, population sizes matter a lot. So if you see in the Western countries, Europe, America, etc., they have these gigantic machines. They are used instead of so like in India we use these sized machines, and the other ones are over 100 kgs. Because of the development in the road, the way the cars, they're able to take those machines with a much higher power to take these x-rays. So there is a qualitative difference. However, due to the constraints in India, for example, the topography or the cultural requirements, or even the way the housing is, it becomes very difficult. You cannot really take such large machines over flights of staircases where there are no elevators, because we have very tall buildings, right, due to population again. So those things definitely do change based on country to country.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I was also wondering about your work, actually, that I'm trying to imagine lots of people going through the community carrying these X-ray machines individually going to houses. And I wonder, is there any data on how cost effective it is to have so many small X-ray machines as compared to a centralized X-ray big machine?
Yeah.
So what is the significant
there
difference?
Is no set data, no quantity.
Okay.
Yes, so the significant difference is that most of the clinics and larger hospitals are not keen on providing the service, just simply because it doesn't really help with their economic structures, or like the cost of it doesn't break even. However, India has this very unique policy of having these third-party organizations, again, because we don't have stringent rules on home X-rays. There are a lot for hospitals and clinics, but what they do is that these third-party organizations that go under the names of these hospitals, clinics, and get a lot of requirements, rather than a hospital that might get one once a month, maybe once in 2 weeks or so. So in those cases, I think it matches the amount, and also the amount for it, the cost of the service itself is almost double at home. However, again, because of the population size, it is an effective service, simply because there are a lot of people over here suffering from various problems or disabilities, which makes it easier for them to just avail the home service.
I did answer, but
Thank you.
Alexander says, "Well,
I was going to ask you, Martin.
Question this.
I was interested in the 4 considerations that you highlighted at the end. So you mentioned the regulation and ethical consideration, and then transparency and trust, dynamism, flexibility, behavior, cognition. And in terms of digital twins generally, how is that unique to what you were looking at in terms of behavior change therapy? Is that the same for any digital twins, or what is unique about those for behavior change therapy?
So I think some of those points are also applicable to other domains. But we have to see that, especially in terms of human digital twin, you can basically implement this in nearly every domain. For example, in industry, you could have a digital twin of the employees that is observing their general well-being, their stress level, and stuff like that. And I mean, of course, when it comes to identifiability, for example, it is also important that you do not confuse the digital twins there. However, I think that especially in behavior changing therapy, this adds a little bit more criticality on the specific aspects. For example, when we take the identifiability, which is basically, I mean, every digital twin should have an identifier. It should be assignable specifically to one instance. But in therapy, this is especially critical because, as I said, if you confuse a digital twin, like if you assign a wrong digital twin to a patient, that might lead to wrong decision suggestion or therapy suggestions, for example, and to the wrong therapy plans, which could lead, in the best case, to a non-effective therapy, and in the worst case, even to a wrong therapy. And therefore, I think that, yes, there are a lot of considerations that are applicable also in general. However, I think they take on a specific role in behavior changing therapy.
Okay. Does anybody wants to jump in and ask any question? John, please go ahead.
Maybe I can ask a question. I have different versions of the same question here. I had thought to ask why we're here. Why do we have a special session on healthcare design processes? And you might argue that what we're doing should just be good design. But if I was to ask the question maybe in a more kindly way, what could the rest of the conference learn from us, where we're doing healthcare design processes and we're seeing particular things and we have particular insights? So maybe each of the speakers could say one thing that they think the rest of the conference should learn from this session and from our applying design in healthcare.
Okay, you want to start, Martin?
Yes, because I already had kind of the reference, because yesterday there was one workshop specifically for digital twins, and they all talked about digital twins in their conventional domain, in which is mostly industry. So I could add a lot of discussion to the topic where I said, well, this is all nice, but we also have to consider that there are other applications, like, for example, healthcare, where, as I said, certain aspects take on a different role, or there are even new aspects that you have to consider in healthcare. So I think that's why it's important that there is a specific section, because I think healthcare has some unique considerations.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yes, of course. I think that since we're talking healthcare, we're talking people, which is, it's often ambiguous and difficult to work with. So in my case, where we have medical training equipment, so we're trying to emulating the human body, which is difficult. And since we're, how can I put it? So in many design processes, we're talking about making, for instance, minimum viable product prototypes as simple as possible. But in healthcare, that's not often possible, because we have something that's quite it's big and hard to grasp, and trying to make it as simple as possible might not be a viable option to actually test it. So I think that might be the thing that others could learn from this session.
Is that with the reference to complexity in healthcare? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Who wants to respond? Tiffany, you want to respond to John's question as well?
So I just want to continue on the complexity of this field. So healthcare, I know everyone kind of touched on something about the complexity. For example, Martin talked about data privacy with the digital trends. I know Rajvi talked about regulation, and those are typical issues that do plague that industry and makes it kind of hard for user design to go through the standard that cycle, right? And then, so I would say that there's other industries that's coming out, that's emerging also, especially with artificial intelligence, the more heavy computing coming out. And then what people can take from healthcare and user design in healthcare is, even though you might have a very complex problem with your structure, with maybe user requirements coming out, applying user design at least simplifies to knowing what your users at the end want, especially if your users at the end is people who needs healthcare.
Thank you, Tiffany. Rajvi, do you want to respond to the same question? What should the conference learn from this session?
Yes, so I believe that in healthcare, the requirement for empathy and merging it with the technical requirements is very strong. Maybe a lot stronger compared to other spaces, because a lot of frail people avail these services, right? So I think that would be the biggest takeaway on how to empathize better.
So empathy is your word. Okay.
Yes.
Natalia and Clement, did you want to?
Natalia. Yeah, to me it seems from the observation that I have that the industry is calling for the change.
You're muted again.
Muted again.
Natalia, yeah.
Yeah, from observations that I have, I see that the healthcare industry is calling for the change. And the way we respond to this change is something that others can learn as well from us. And it's vice versa, because there is so much we can learn from the rest of the industries. That would be my short.
All right, thank you. I mean, I was also going to ask another question, which I think would apply to all of you as well. And I mean, it's along the area, it's a question of risk. And I think we know that with every new solution, sorry, it's raining over here, so it's a bit noisy. With every new solution, can be a new kind of risk. So I wondered if you've considered in your different proposals, whether it's with the X-ray, behavior chain, all of that, what are the risks with what you propose, and how do you think those could be mitigated? Who wants to start? Or is everything risk-free, maybe, which would be excellent?
I could start.
Okay, Martin.
So basically, with digital twins in general, there are some risks also stated in literature that can be adapted to digital twins or human digital twins in general also.
Martin, you're muted.
Do you hear me now?
I can hear you, Martin.
Okay. So maybe you muted me specifically? Oh, okay. So maybe go on the 3 dots on my picture and click unmute if I'm muted only for you.
I can hear you, Martin.
Okay.
Can you hear Clement?
No, we cannot.
Maybe refresh
Can you hear
browser.
us now?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, no, that's him. Yeah, they can hear us, but it's...
Can you refresh your browser, please, if you're still having problems?
Yeah.
Okay. Should I just start to answer anyway, or should we wait?
Yeah, please go on.
Okay. So there are specifically risks stated in terms of, for example, if the digital twin takes over regularly the decisions for the therapists, would the therapist at some point maybe lose his practice or gets out of practice because he does not have to make the decisions anymore himself?
Okay.
This would be one risk, for example. Same goes, for example, what if the decisions are wrong, or what if the decisions are biased towards a certain, because you train the artificial intelligence, it might be underlying the system with certain data. But if you do not represent like all the population in that data, then the decisions could be biased. So those would be just 2 examples of risks. And there are a number more that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah. I think we saw during the pandemic, there were loads of open source hardware projects where people were making ventilators to treat COVID-19. That was also one of the starting points when we started out this project, because we saw that there were suddenly tons of medical training, both training equipment such as we made, but also actual medical equipment that was made open source. And there are no sort of regulations or frameworks for testing such equipment. So I guess there's a huge risk there that needs to be addressed, whereas we don't have any way of testing out these open source hardware solutions for healthcare.
So do you mean that there is no regulation at all to make those things and actually use them in a healthcare system?
There probably is to use them, but I mean, they're shared on sites like Thingiverse and Instructable, so people could make them at home if they wanted to, or is desperate enough. So
okay. Tiffany, did you want to comment on that?
I mean, for us, the data portal isn't exactly as risky as a medical device or something that is a decision-making tool for patients, since ours is more of a tool for medical researchers to make some sort of conclusion about biological data. So for risk, there are some risk of if we provide wrong data, correct? So we do need to make sure the data that we do have is biologically correct. So if a medical researcher looks at biological data that we processed and is incorrect in a way, and they're making wrong conclusions about, for example, they're doing cancer research on lungs, then they're making a wrong conclusion about whatever the gene or the molecule that we're looking at.
So is there any way that you're mitigating that now?
Yes, so as I talked about, we have a lot of teams, right? I work on user interface. We do have a team specifically for how we ingest all that data from the university to submit all the biological data to make sure they meet a standard that we have.
Okay, thank you. Rajvi?
In the case of home X-rays, I believe the equipment risk would be much lower because those undergo their own processes. However, there is regulation risk. If the regulation is not set, there is a lot of behavioral aspects that come in. For example, not wearing the radiation safety vests in the for radiographers. And such practices that could pose a risk. So if it's not designed well to make it efficient for them and comfortable, it would definitely become a risk. So testing is important, I guess.
Thank you. Natalia, did you want to say something about the risk?
Sure. Well, the risk, we think it prolongs the development cycle a lot. So it brings the cost and time, but at the end, the product that we get will be more secure. And for healthcare domain, it's of course one of the major factors. So I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wonder whether somebody wants to jump in and ask another question. I don't want to be asking all the questions.
And I would like to add another risk, maybe that is a little bit more general for all the healthcare domain, is basically also the risk of equally distribution, because we already talked about with the X-rays, for example, that better developed countries might have newer and better devices than less developed countries. And I think that this is a big risk and a big responsibility also for the developers, is to always see, when you're developing a medical device, make it as good but also as cheap basically as possible, so that really most of the users can actually have access to that.
Yeah, I guess the high price would exclude some people, right, from being able to afford. Okay. If anybody wants to ask a question, please do share your video and audio and join us, or just type in the chat box. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so still plenty of time. Any question? I will have more questions, but I don't want to take all the time with my questions.
I actually have a question for Martin. So
yes, go ahead.
You spoke about the virtual avatar, right? For rehabilitation. So in the case of a visually impaired person or a blind person, how do you think that would become different?
So of course the avatar itself as a graphical tool would be then maybe not applicable to a visually impaired person, but you can still combine in general, your goal should be to combine multiple ways of feedback. And for example, you could replace or also complete the avatar with a verbal agent, for example. You can think of virtual assistants like Siri or whatever, and they could basically motivate the patient with verbal feedback by saying, hey, look, you did way better than the last session, for example. And in that case, kind of connect this virtual assistant to the data from your digital twin to personalize and individualize the feedback in that way.
Okay, I have a question for you, Daniel. I was interested, in your conclusion, you said something like, without user testing, the errors and other interactions might not have been identified. And I thought, because we're talking about prototyping and testing, which I thought are part of a design process. So I wonder what you thought was unique about what you were trying to do that is separate from a usual design process where you prototype and test.
I think that we talked about this being complex problems, and one of the main problems with sort of early phase prototyping and trying to develop new medical training equipment that emulates the human body, they need to have some sort of fidelity in order to be close enough to reality to actually be tested. So I guess we're talking about trying to test things in scenarios that are realistic, as opposed to sort of in the earlier stages when we just go back and forth with expert users or practitioners that test out prototypes.
Okay. So is the opportunity you have to do that with the practitioners, that is the unique part of what you're presenting, is that right? If I understood that well.
Yeah, I think just having a scenario that's realistic.
Yeah, okay.
And sort of as you would use the product when it's finished.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Natalia, I was also thinking about your presentation. I was a bit curious about your objective, that was to develop a lean, agile approach, which I thought if you develop a MedTech product development approach, why did you choose to develop a lean, agile approach? Why did you take a more open-ended approach to what might work best? You seem to have made a choice about the approach you wanted.
So we looked at that case study that we had, and based on the challenges that they faced, we thought that by lean and elements of lean and agile approach, we can solve this. So that was mostly coming from the problem itself. So it wasn't that we wanted to apply lean, agile, whatever, no matter what. It was driven by the case study that we had.
Okay.
I would also have one more question to Natalia.
Yeah.
Because everyone, also in industry, at some point was talking about lean or agile production, for example. But is lean and agile approaches, are those always the way to go? Or can you think of applications maybe where you would rather stick with the conventional and rather rigid development processes?
Well, I'm sure there are industries and there are projects where these can work. It's just that for healthcare, for especially software products or hardware with a software component product, it just shows that the waterfall is not working properly because you want to deliver faster in a more agile fashion, let's say. So bringing that practice from IT development just shows that it's a lot more convenient and a lot more beneficial. So just the way it is developed right now, the software piece is not working. So this is bringing the best practices from the other industries. Eliminates a little bit the way, but for example, for our framework, we didn't only use lean agile, we used also system thinking. So concurrent engineering there, which is part of the hardware development. So it's not that you can fully integrate agile, for example, for that process. But I'm sure there are products and projects and industries where the one flow can work out nicely, but I don't think it's a healthcare where software component is present. Not anymore.
Any other questions? Maybe I have one last question for you, Martin. Again, I was trying to imagine your digital twin for behavior change. I can understand my medical doctor having a digital twin of my heart where they can monitor what's going on with me, and that fits into that medical process. How do you imagine the digital twin for behavior change working in reality? So if I want to have that, is it me having it or is it my doctor having that? How is it going to work?
So the way we kind of imagine it at the moment is that we could have a dashboard in which the exercises can be integrated into kind of computer games like Wii Sports, for example. And this can be connected to a dashboard where, similar to other, like, for example, role-playing computer games, you see your avatar in front of you. And maybe, for example, at the beginning of the therapy, this avatar is just able to just move like slow, like a little bit, like with very limited movements. And throughout the avatar, you could then, with improving range of movement, for example, of the patient, you could then let the avatar also have a higher range of movement in the start screen, for example, which could motivate the patient because he could see, oh, wait, he did not do these movements at the beginning of the therapy, but now the patient can see that his avatar is able to make way more movements than he could at the beginning. And he can transfer this to himself because he himself is able to make more movements than in the beginning. Or, for example, you can visualize the progress also to the patient, so that the patient can, with simple graphs, for example, can actually see how his range of movement, for example, improved during the past 3 weeks. And that would be highly motivating for the patient to actually see an improvement there, instead of just having the therapist saying, oh, well, look, you're doing way better than before. I think it's way better when the patient sees it himself on a scale, for example, or on a graph.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all our presenters, and congratulations once again, Martin, on your award. And,
thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's been a very lovely, stimulating session. Thank you, and enjoy your conference.
Thank you. Bye.